Estamos aqui para dar voz ao povo, em defesa dos cidadãos, pela dignidade humana. Todos temos deveres, mas também todos temos direitos. Será que existe justiça? Isto é o povo a falar. Olá, muito boa noite e bem-vindos a mais um Isto é o Povo a Falar. Recordo que a emissão é em simultâneo aqui na Curiacos TV e também na Rádio Vida 97.1. Pascal Coppens é um belga que se dedicou durante cerca de mais de metade da sua vida às novas tecnologias e muito especialmente durante 20 anos trabalhando na China, não só para companhias, mas também criando a sua própria empresa. E isso tornou, obviamente, depois, ao longo do tempo, e por causa da sua dedicação e da forma como estudou a China, tornou-se naquilo que nós podemos chamar de sinólogo, ou seja, um especialista na China, especialmente naquilo que é a vertente económica. E, obviamente, não podemos também dissociar a economia da China da sua cultura, daí que seja importante termos em perspectiva que a China é todo uma nação com os muitos e muitos milhões de pessoas que são, aliás, cerca de 1 bilhão e 700 milhões de pessoas, mas convém também entender todo o processo que tem levado a China a liderar aquilo que é a inovação. O Pascal é o nosso convidado de hoje. A entrevista vai ser feita em inglês, que pode seguir depois com as legendas. Pascal, good evening. Thank you so much for you to being here. I was saying to our viewers and our audience that you spent almost 20 years in China.
Yes.
Also, you became what we call a specialist in China, not just because of your economic and your entrepreneurial side, but also because of the cultural side. You cannot divide China's economy also from its own culture. And one of the books that you wrote, you said that China would set standards of innovation. Right now, China is leading the world in innovation.
In many, many aspects they are, yes. And in the book that I wrote, it's already, I think it's from 2019, that's quite some time ago. I did talk about all the different sectors where China would start to innovate. And if we look now, it's very clear that China in many, many sectors is starting to set the standard. I think electrical vehicle, people know about it, but there's many others in the medical area, in manufacturing, in
AI,
and lots and lots. And it's all in that book from 2019, but it's now it's starting to play out.
And it's amazing because, the world came to a still after 2019 because of the pandemic issue, but still China didn't throw away the idea and the goals that they had set.
Well, actually, China just continued on the path and the trend that they were starting. They started off before. We just didn't look at China, watch China for about 3 years, also because China was closed off. Many foreigners weren't visiting China, so there wasn't enough information, but it was very clear that this trend that started in 2015 really continued in 2019 up to today. And it's very impressive what China has done the last years, but we're not talking much about it.
But let me tell you what we talk about, at least here in this program, with many, if not most of our guests. We don't understand for instance, Europe has started to the tariffs and to impose more, I don't know if you call it taxes on EVs or electrical vehicles that come from China. For many of us, it was a surprise because the European industry told Brussels, please, can you stop it because you are hurting us?
Yeah, it was mainly the Germans, because the German car industry is quite important for its own industry, for jobs. Also in Sweden, they were saying, don't do this. In France, that was a little bit different. They wanted to have import tariffs. But the real issue was that they thought, or they believed in Europe very much that Beijing was not playing fairly because they had given lots of subsidies to the Chinese car industry and the battery makers and so on. The reality is very different, of course. We have to go back more than 10 years ago. And if we look more than 10 years ago, what we see is that Beijing and China had two big problems. There was oil. They were mainly dependent on oil, and so they needed another way, and batteries is a solution for that. But there was also a lot of pollution. I've lived in the pollution of China, and I can tell you 10 years ago it was really bad. So China wanted to solve that problem internally, and because they did that, they indeed give subsidies to many of these car manufacturers. But I always say, if we in Europe would 10 years ago have done the exact same thing, then probably we would have the same car manufacturers in Germany and France and not recreated this whole industry to go electrical and to go connected and to go autonomous and so on, which China is doing. So in my view, the subsidies has helped to get it started, but it really, the subsidies in China has created a completely new environment, which is now the challenge that we have, that they've innovated more than we expected.
And how would you respond, or how did Beijing respond to the argument that the tariffs are just to level the playing field?
Well, I don't really believe we're leveling the playing field. What we are going to do is we're forcing the Chinese manufacturers and battery makers now to come more to Europe, to produce here in Europe, probably in Eastern Europe. And what that means is that we're bringing their innovation and their strength in marketing and production and to Europe. And it might sound good for jobs, but actually most of these factories are completely automated. So we're not going to get much jobs from it. But what we're going to get is suddenly that these Chinese are now going to compete in our own market. And I'm not sure that's such a good thing long term. But at the same time, if we work with them, we can, of course, create some collaboration.
But one of the things that is going to do, or it's been doing also, is to create, it's more difficult for most of Europeans to buy electrical vehicle because the main Chinese brands were highly competitive in that side.
Yeah, they were price-wise, they were much cheaper for the same quality of cars, and now they're going to become more expensive. So it's going to take longer for many people to make a decision to go into electrical, which of course with the climate goals that we have in Europe, it's not very smart that we slow this down.
And tell me something, even if it is fully automated, don't you think that it's a little bit further from the supply chain of some materials that we need, and the cars will actually be more expensive than fully built in China?
Of
and
course.
Then shipped into Europe?
Yeah, of course, definitely, because they've built a whole supply chain of the battery, of the production, the assembly, but also all these suppliers around it, the whole logistics around it, and also the R&D and the innovation that's coming. Most of the car manufacturers, including the Chinese and the Western, have spent lots of investment into China because that is where it's all happening. It's like you would say, I want to build a software company, but I'm not interested in Silicon Valley. It's like the same thing. If you want to build a car company in electrical vehicles, you have to be in China, because that is where the most advanced things are happening.
And one of the things that you mentioned in your newsletter also is because of that, the Chinese economy has been able to create a new ecosystem, which is, for instance, in recycling or in battery. So, it's not just put the car in the center, but all the environment that needs to feed into the final product.
Yeah. No, the car is becoming human-centric and it's becoming energy-centric. What it means is that it's all about connecting it to the grid and making it smarter, so a much smarter car than before. And it's also human-centric, which means that you can talk to the dashboard and you can do crazy things in China when you get into a car. I mean, there's karaoke or KTV, there's lots of cool stuff that you can do, which you can't do with a Western car. So they have all these bells and whistles. It's a way for the Chinese to feel like, it's like they're going into their iPhone or their Android phone and play with the car rather than just the car itself. So the human-centric aspect is something that we've missed over the past 4 years, and that China has done very well. And so as many young people are now buying electrical vehicles in China, and that will happen here too, they want really that connectivity rather than just a car that brings them from A to B.
And one of the things that the EVs have created also it's because it's such a high demand that even phone manufacturers are entering into the electric vehicles market.
Xiaomi has the SU7 and now the SU7 Ultra, which is kind of like a Ferrari, Porsche highest level type, which, I mean, Apple wanted to buy a car. That's more than 10 years ago. They never did it. But China did it. Why is Xiaomi doing it? Why is Huawei helping to build cars? Is because they understand this software ecosystem. They understand what consumers want. And it's not about mobility only, it's also about connectivity. And I think that's where the real difference is. So you have all these new models and new ideas, like NIO has this battery swap where you can just swap a battery instead of having cables and so on. And so they have all these new concepts that come out of players that were never built a car before. And that is because, of course, electrical vehicles is more easy to build than a combustion engine, because the battery is already quite standard and you can just build everything around it.
Let me use the electric vehicles to talk a little bit, because at the time that we are recording in the United States, they are choosing the new older of the White House, and one of the candidates is how do you say, backed by
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk. Imagine that with Trump winning, can Elon Musk, because he has so much things invested in China, be a natural bridge into both administrations?
I'm convinced of that. I mean, first of all, not many people know that Elon Musk built its biggest factory in China, in Shanghai, the Gigafactory, which has more than 1 million cars that came out of that factory already. And so the whole concept of China was, let's bring Tesla into China. This is many years ago. And then the whole supply chain will have to adapt to the standard of Tesla. And that is why now any supplier that wants to build the highest quality is based in China, and they're often Chinese.
That's true.
And so Elon Musk understood that if he has a market that is given to him, and he was the first actually car manufacturer that had a fully 100% owned company. So it wasn't a joint venture with a Chinese partner. And so he has his own company, 100% fully owned by Tesla. And that was simply the Chinese way of thinking. Bring someone in with all that potential, people will start buying Teslas, the supply chain will create, and then other car manufacturers can benefit from it.
But the standard is the
standard is that. And the Chinese government is giving Elon Musk many opportunities to actually build out this market because they see the benefit themselves. Now for Elon, of course, it means that China is very important because it's a big part, if not the biggest part of his revenue, and Tesla is the biggest part of his revenue as a company.
Just let me give a step back, and how important is China also for the revenues of European companies?
Well, companies
European brands.
like BMW, Volkswagen, I mean, they do more than 30, almost 40% of all their revenue is coming from China.
40%?
40%. So if they lose the Chinese market, it's a big hit. Now, on top of that, if you look at the last years, their sales has gone down in China because the Chinese competitors have become so good. And it's not just a matter of price, it's a matter of quality very often. So they now are faced, if they are losing the whole market of China because they are not in China or they have a lot of challenges, like these import tariffs, then the result will be that ultimately they will not be doing as well even in Europe also because there's not going to be as much revenue.
But not everything is fully electrical in China. There are a lot of products that are being developed also for hybrid cars.
Yes.
So I don't know if Beijing is as Brussels that wants to finish all the oil cars or I don't know how to say it in
fuel
English.
Cars, yes.
Fuel cars, or if they have a margin for them to still exist.
No, the interesting thing from a European point of view is that hybrids are not having any additional tariffs. So it's only 10%, like all cars imported from China. What that means is that Chinese who are building hybrids, BYD is building hybrids, there's many brands that are building hybrids, are now, of course, going to bring all these hybrids to Europe because it's going to be much cheaper. And CATL is the biggest battery producer in the world. They have almost 40% of all the battery production in the world, more than 30%. And so the interesting thing is that CATL is now developing a battery a hybrid that can go 400 kilometers long and a fuel car on top of it, so a hybrid system. So you can actually have the same as if you would buy almost a Tesla, but then you have a fuel tank on top of it, just in case you need to drive further or if you don't have time to go and charge your car. So the hybrid is going to come to Europe very much. In China, there's also hybrid. But because most Chinese live in cities and they travel from one side to the other, they don't really need that fuel tank very often, except if they go to another city, which doesn't happen that often.
Yeah. And if they do it, they use probably the high-speed trains.
Yes, the high-speed trains is
which is another amazing
topic,
thing.
yes,
that
yes.
Is. Can you get us there? Because Portugal bought a few years ago high-speed trains without preparing high-speed rails. So the high-speed train never got high speed.
Well, yeah, that's not very smart, maybe. But,
no, really. But in China,
yes.
I've seen.
Well, they've built more high-speed train tracks than the whole world together since 2008. 2008 was when they started building the first. That was the first release of the first high-speed train, and every year it's like thousands of kilometers of high-speed train track. And what's interesting there is that this has created an opportunity for many people to travel to the cities and live outside of the cities, because it became too expensive to live in the cities. And so this high-speed train is kind of commuting between both, but also because the planes are congested. I mean, it's a lot of planes. People prefer taking the train. You go from Beijing to Shanghai, it's 4.5 hours. And they're now building new trains which are going to go at even higher speeds, 600 kilometers an hour, which will take you like 3 hours from Beijing to Shanghai.
And also one of the things that I was able to understand and see when I was in China is that China are looking also for those tools, but also in a touristic way of seeing things. Like the train travel doesn't have just to be a connection. It can also be a way of a tourist to know the country.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the whole idea is about connecting people. And one of the things that the Chinese government has done very well is to connect the west of the country, which is much poorer than the east, where everybody lives around the coastal sites, and to make the west attractive for people from the east to travel there and learn about the other people outside. I mean, the cultures, the different minorities and so on, but also for the people from the West to have an easy way to go to the big cities. Yeah.
One of the news that, I don't know if you put it on your newsletter, but I saw recently China just built 200 kilometers of road without using any people. Fully automated,
yes.
And this takes me also to fully autonomous vehicles. How is China doing in that regard?
Well, when it comes to automation, 52% of all the industrial robots in the world are bought by China. That's 1 out of 2 robots used in factories or to build roads or to build whatever it is actually bought by China for China. Now, half of that amount, so 25% of the world's robots, industrial robots, are made in China for China. So there's no other country that compares even in the speed of automation that is happening into the factories.
They have a fully container terminals, right?
Yes, they have a fully automated container terminal in Tianjin. And the idea is to have like 19 container terminals in the next years, fully automated, so no more people, except maybe to manage and control the cranes and so on from a distance. But that is really the direction it's going. And it's not just in the containers, it's in mining, it's in many industries, in the medical care. There's an AI hospitals without doctors in China. So it's really starting to become much more like, let's integrate all that AI, all that automation into the real businesses, and then in every possible industry. And in some industries, we are already 5 years behind China.
Now we've been talking about how China is doing well in these areas. We'll get back to that also. But I cannot, it will not be okay. I cannot talk to you without asking that China's growth didn't quite get to where predictions were. I think it was 5.2 or something like that. Is there something that they should worry about, or from your connections, Beijing is already thinking about it?
Yeah, no, China is quite worried about the economy, specifically after they got out of the pandemic. 2023, January, they started feeling really that the economy was under pressure, even before that, but it became more visible once they got out of the pandemic. And so that is the moment where they saw that the debt of the local governments were really too high. The real estate was starting to really crash very quickly or go down very quickly. People were not investing in new business. So the Chinese economy for a number of years has been under enormous pressure. That's a fact. Now, it still is growing at 5%. And you could say, yeah, okay, it comes from 10%, so it's really going down very, very fast. But 5% now is actually in total volume of additional GDP more than 10% 10 years ago. So the additional value or additional GDP they generate on top of it is still more today than it was 10 years. But society expects more from China. And we've always expected China to grow, and that growth is going down. That's already 10 years that it started to slow down, but now it's getting more and more hard. And the main reason is the real estate.
How did the government deal with the question of real estate? Because, for instance, Portugal, a couple of years ago, there was a problem with the banks, and the government took our taxes and saved the banks. But I don't know if China, for instance, if Beijing saved Evergrande.
Beijing is not saving Evergrande. They're maybe saving the people who bought apartments and paid something in advance, and their apartment wasn't finished. They're trying to make sure that people get at least what they paid for. But the big investors and those that took risks, they're not saving them. China actually had created many years ago, 3-4 years ago, a new regulation where that real estate companies would have to they would have to be transparent on the loans that they took. And then based on the loans that they took, the Beijing government decided you are in a red zone, a very dangerous zone, just like Evergrande and Country Garden. And so they were kind of let go into this industry. Like now they couldn't get new loans. And if they couldn't get new loans, they couldn't keep building. And so they died very quickly. Well, many of the others were kind of not aided, but said you can get a little bit loans or you can still get loans because you're doing a good job. And so that separation changed the whole real estate. And so where the problem with Chinese investment for the past 20 years, where do you put your money in China?
Yeah.
And there was only one place that was growing like crazy, and that was real estate. I mean, the financial sector, like the stock exchange, was not so good, wasn't always transparent. There weren't many funds and other possibilities, pension funds and so on. So Chinese put all their money into real estate, and they expected that to keep growing, and that stopped.
And just to for our viewers and listeners to understand, this is not a problem that let people be without houses. These are people that had money and they wanted to invest money on a second or third house.
Yeah, and they've built too much. Now, have they built too much is the question. There's a lot of empty apartments today, but there's also still a lot of people that don't have an apartment in the cities and would love to go to the cities to live there. So, and that's where the government will probably at one point buy out some of these apartment blocks and then help the people from the western part of the country to migrate to some of these cities and fill these apartments. So there's a lot of people. That's one advantage that China has to fill the apartments. It's just how to pay for it.
There's something that for me it caught my attention is that regarding space transportation, China is thinking about building a Mach 4 plane that would do Beijing, New York in 2 hours.
Yeah. In 2027, they want to have this operation. Now, I don't know if it's going to happen in the next 3 years, but it is amazing that they're at a hypersonic level of technology that is years ahead of the US. The US admitted that themselves. Even Pentagon said that, where now they're looking at commercial travel for these things, both space travel as between large cities like Beijing and New York. It's going at lightning speed, some of these innovations.
And it's a game changer, not just because of the speed, the time it takes from Beijing to New York, but also because it is vertical takeoff and landing.
Vertical takeoff and landing. That's a huge industry in China now, not just with the space area, but the whole vertical takeoff and landing with drones.
With drones.
Anything under 1,000 meters height is the big industry besides clean tech, so green industry and electrical vehicles.
Did I see a taxi drone?
Yes, I've sat in one. So I've been in a taxi in the south of China called Yihang. It's a brand. Xpeng is another one. They have like 3-4 big brands. And the idea of Yihang, which I visited in Guangzhou in the south of China, is that in the next 3 years, they want to have 1,000 flying taxis in Shenzhen. And they have a license to do that. And it would be, at that capacity, it would be only $50 to take a flying taxi from one side of the city to another side of the city. So if you're worried about missing your plane, you can just take a flying taxi.
Yeah, don't take a train because you may miss something.
So that's all happening today, and this is this vertical takeoff and landing new industry.
And also in this newsletter, one of the things that we know that has been happening is the ships war. But you say that 3 companies in China have found a way not to be dependent and create independence regarding that.
Well, there's many companies in China working on fixing the problem that they cannot get access to certain chips from the US or materials or even equipment like from ASML in the Netherlands, which is needed to build these chips. So China feels they're really contained by the West, specifically America, to not be able to develop their own chips and develop products for these chips. And so they, for the last many years, since Biden started the Chips and Science Act, have really started to double down on building chips. They've already done this for a decade, but now there's so much money going into chip development. And these 3 companies I talked about in my newsletter is companies based in Wuhan. And these companies are building a new memory chip. They're building something that could be used for lithography, which is what is needed for building the extreme ultraviolet light machines from ASML, for example. And there's other chip manufacturers that are constantly coming up. Every month, there's one more company that comes up with something that we already have, but that we didn't expect the Chinese to be able to do. And it's more interesting to see that we were convinced they couldn't do it, and every month there's something they say, oh yes, we've done this, we've done that. And this is a lot of companies in China that are now getting money from the government to do it. Yeah.
Something that we already had. We already had a double folded phone, but Chinese
they have a trifold phone, yes.
Yeah, a trifold.
Huawei, yes. They're very good in screen development, China. It's actually only China that still can build the screens at a very high level. And so Huawei has just released a trifold, so a
it's
phone
like
in 3.
A phone.
So it goes from a phone to a tablet. And it has, the interesting thing is that it also includes the Harmony OS from Huawei, which is quite unique because it's the first operating system in the world that is challenging Android and iOS from Apple. And so in China, they already have 17% of the market share. But it could go through the global south to Southeast Asia, to Africa, to Latin America.
Now we come back to society because although China is leading innovation and all these products are available, what we see is that consumption is not as Beijing predicted it would be.
Yeah, Beijing has a real challenge to get people to consume more. So the Chinese, by definition, already are savers. I mean, they like to save a lot of money. They save more than 40% of their salary today. And so they are not consuming enough, which is a huge issue because in the American capitalistic model, it's about if you consume more, then you grow more and you can basically...
But just let me say something. So Chinese, that for years we've been listening that have misery salaries, are able to save more than 40%, and still they live, eat, drink, clothe themselves.
Yes.
Amazing.
So the middle class, which is about 500 to 600 million people today, they're saving the same amount, and they still have the same quality of life as we have in the middle class in Europe. And so, yes, they are saving a lot.
But that creates the stress.
But that creates the problem because they need to consume more for the economy to start again, but also for businesses to invest. If consumers are not buying, then businesses are not investing. And so this is a little bit a chicken and an egg situation. Consumers are waiting for the businesses are waiting for the consumers. And so some industries, you don't see this problem. With electrical vehicles, you don't see this problem. But with other industries, you do see the issue.
One of the things that when we talk about saving and we talk about this slowing down of consuming consumer products is that there is still alive a generation of people that 2 or 3 people eat from one bowl of rice. So these are people that have seen the transformation of China, but they have maybe traumas, and they may think it can happen again. Or you don't think the social aspect of that generation has no.
I think the trauma that China has is more because of the pandemic than it is from the people that were poor and maybe didn't join the middle class. And that is because Beijing is really putting everything strategically to help these 900 million poor people, not in the middle class, to bring them as much. So they're doing a lot for it. So somehow they're still believing this can happen. The people that are more traumatic is the middle class, urban citizens, which have lived through the pandemic and where they see that jobs are not available always, or it's jobs like delivery guys or something like that, but there's not really good jobs. And that's a bigger issue.
They saw also government maybe keep China closed longer than it should have been?
Yes. So, I mean, it depends who you talk to, but many people feel that China should have opened up 9 months earlier than it did. And that for some businesses that really weren't doing that well, they might have gone bust. People might have lost their jobs after the pandemic because they didn't fire many people during the pandemic, but afterwards they started firing, or they didn't hire new people. And so, yeah, people are a little bit feeling that the economy this year is not going better than last year, and that's for 2-3 years in a row already. It puts a lot of stress on the economy.
So, consumers' debt will never be a problem in China?
Consumer debt?
Yeah.
Well, they have a lot of money. There is credit card debt, but not like in the US. I mean, it's.
But there's another problem with that probably in China, which is the provinces, the government of the provinces debt, right?
Yes. So the local governments are very much indebted, and that is because for 30 years, growth was the only mantra in China. So the GDP had to be 10%, 12% more every year, and so. How did they get that happening? A lot of it was to sell land, and then the real estate developers could develop on that, and that created, of course, new companies and innovation, and it brought in taxes and so on. But the taxes weren't always distributed evenly between Beijing and the local governments. So they kept selling land. But then when real estate goes down, you keep with a lot of debt, but you don't have the revenue that comes in anymore. And so some of these cities are really high into debt.
When we look also for some of the goals that China have, for instance, you say in your newsletter that they plan to increase fiscal support for the data industry. Knowing how many Chinese people are, how important this investment is.
Yeah, so China is targeted to use data as a way to accelerate the economy. What it means is that they believe that they have lots of data, and they do, and this is public data, or it's government data in a way, but with all the privacy that is needed. But that data should be shared, should be used if it is safe. And so if it's from a national security point of view, it's okay to save it. Then, for example, hospital data of patients, you're not going to share. But maybe the statistics of how a hospital is building, you can share that, and then companies can use that, and it's becoming a trading of data in China to help companies to acquire data, and that's because AI needs a lot of data. And with artificial intelligence, if now suddenly that data is something that the government helps to to share and distribute in a way that is controlled,
there's
a lot of opportunity.
Can we imagine something like this? So the government has access to some data from a hospital point of view, and he shares, for instance, with companies in that area, and they see that in some provinces, for instance, the rate of some type of diseases is this high.
Yep.
That can make to an investment decision
That's the
by
idea.
that.
And that's the whole concept. So if you know, for example, that this hospital is doing better than another hospital, you can actually share that data and they can learn from it. But also AI can aggregate all that data from over the whole China and then figure out how to optimize and help these hospitals to become more efficient. And so ultimately it's good for drug development, it's good for hospital management, it's good for the patient.
And also I've seen some schools that are using also AI to get data from the students. They use like headsets
Yes.
and it helps also the teacher to see who is the student that pays more attention to which subject he pays more attention. How important is this, and how unviable would be this in one European school?
Well, I've seen that same post from many years ago, but I've never seen, besides that one school, anybody else doing it in China. So I don't think it's a trend.
Okay.
I think it's something that they tried out, because Chinese do sometimes crazy things. They want to try something, and sometimes it fails, sometimes it works. This one went viral because in the West and Europe we would never accept this, but it also hasn't happened in China. So I think we have to be careful believing that China is using all the data, which is private data, in order to use it against the people. That's not the intention.
Another race that is happening is between US and China for a global biotech innovation. Again, how important it is for China to be ahead in this sector?
Well, China over the past 7 years has really taken a leap into biotechnology. And that's a lot of things. Of course, it's about genetics, but it's also about things like drug development. It's about life sciences, even for animals or for humans. And so they've done a lot of developments. Today, almost 1/3, 27%, I think, of all the clinical trials in the world are done in China. And that is because there's a lot of people. It's easier to do than in the US. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of talent. I mean, thousands and thousands of life scientists that are building and researching things. People that were trained in the US or trained in Europe often went back to China. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. And the government supports that because they want drugs and medicines to become cheaper. Because if they're cheaper, more people can actually have access to it. And that's, again, that from Beijing. You have to make things affordable, easy to access.
It's interesting, but Beijing does it. At the same time, it still allows ancient medicines to be available in the market.
It's a combination, because they believe in both. And if you go to a hospital, public hospital in China, the doctor will most of the times prescribe both traditional and Western medicine at the same time. If one doesn't work, the other might work. So they give you two prescriptions at once. And traditional Chinese medicine is something that is thousands of years old, where most Chinese still believe that it really works well. But of course, if you have a cancer, you can't just treat that with traditional Chinese medicine. So it depends on the situation. So Western medicine is very good for making sure things, a disease you have is quickly solved, but to keep healthy, traditional Chinese medicine is very good. That's why a lot of old people in China are pretty healthy.
And regarding AI, which is probably the biggest revolution we've been seeing in the latest years, how is China doing? Well, this is just, I need to make this question.
Yes.
We know the answer. But also, if China is not worried that this will decrease the number of laborers of people working in the factories.
Well, yes, but it's a problem and a solution at the same time. So there's a pre-ChatGPT moment and a post-ChatGPT moment in November 2022. So anything before ChatGPT came out, China was really ahead of the West, specifically Europe, but also even America. Not so much in the AI algorithms, but implementing them into society. We're years ahead. That's what I wrote my book about. It's all about AI in many, many sectors. But after ChatGPT, then the whole world was suddenly like, oh, what's happening? The US is still ahead. And now today, since ChatGPT came out, people are not talking about China. But if you go to China and you watch it, and I write about this in every newsletter, I mean, there's 200 large language models. There's 50 different companies building AI, generative AI large language models in many applications, and some of the coolest things are coming out of China. We're just like with the electrical vehicles, we weren't watching. We're not watching what's happening into the large language models in China. So I think in 3 years from now, we're going to say, how is it possible we didn't see that China is implementing this AI in so many industries and make it so easy for consumers to use some of these models?
And that is one of the things that is most surprising in China, is because it's consumer driven.
Yes.
At the end of the day, anything that is working, if it works for the consumer, it's fine by them. That's the goal.
Yes, but now there's also a switch that Chinese are going more and more into business to business.
Okay.
And so before it was all about consumers, and if we thought about innovation, we thought about Alibaba, we thought about Tencent with WeChat, we thought about ByteDance with TikTok, we thought about B2C. But today you go into innovation and in AI, it's all B2B, whether it's in agriculture, in healthcare, whether it's in logistics, whether it's in mobility, I mean, anywhere. It's all B2B these days, and it's about putting automation, AI, and then of course 5G and soon 6G into all of these applications to make everything smarter and more connected. So yes, B2B is becoming more and more important, and services as well. And I think that's something we're not watching when it comes to China, because we always feel, as a consumer in Europe, I'm not going to buy a Chinese large language model or software from China. But we're forgetting that the business-to-business environment is very different. They're just looking at performance and efficiency and price. And so that's the big change.
But don't you think that is going to also be a challenge? Because, industrial revolution, if you look at, for instance, Ford, thousands and thousands of workers. But
yes. For the workforce, it is a problem. But it's also a solution to the problem, because China's demography is declining, so there's less people being born or children being born in China. So they have a workforce problem in 10, 20 years from now. So they need AI to solve that problem. And then they need to use AI, artificial intelligence, as well as automation to increase the productivity. So the problem is not so much will it replace jobs, it's more can people increase their productivity and then sell for China, but also sell for the world. And if the productivity can go up with these technologies, they should be able to give enough support for the people in China.
To find another thing that AI needs is obviously computers to feed them, and that's another race. Is it possible that China has already a quantum computer?
Well, China already has a quantum computer, and I know I'm going to say every time they have this, but it's true. In Hefei, they have a quantum computer, and in some areas they're really advanced. But China has, the last year, put more emphasis on AI than on quantum.
Okay.
Baidu and Alibaba, they sold their quantum computers to the government, to the universities. So they're now putting everything on AI. And this is a general trend worldwide. It's not just in China. So quantum is cool, it's nice, but AI is still the thing where everything happens. But when we talk about computers or cloud environment or data centers, China's strategy for data centers is very different from the US. China has a decentralized strategy, which means in every city in China, everywhere, specifically in the West, there's cloud data centers. While in America, it's all concentrated around one area in Virginia. I mean, Microsoft, Google, Meta from Facebook, they all have that same place. And China is doing that because in one place they have solar energy, in the other place they have hydropower, in another place they have a lot of wind. And so they're using the renewable energy to put the data centers where needed, and then they're connecting them to the big cities. For the past 10 years, China has built an ultra-high voltage transmission lines between the East and the West, which no other country in the world has built, even on 1% of what China has built. It's incredible the distances that they do, 2,000–3,000 kilometers, to actually bring all that energy and all that data from one side to the other side of China.
Just recently, the BRICS summit ended. How did you see the amount of other nations that want to participate in this project?
Well, since the war in Ukraine started, we see BRICS becoming more and more important, and that is also because the BRICS countries feel that they need to unite more. Because we are very busy in Europe and in America with our own problems. We're forgetting a little bit the rest of the world. And so BRICS has really started to become more or accelerated more in the last 2-3 years. And now they're creating much more collaboration between themselves. And if you look at it, since last year, there's an extended BRICS. Before it was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Mm-hmm. Now there's 6 more countries that joined last year, including Saudi Arabia, there's Iran, there's Ethiopia, there's all these countries. But now there's 30 more countries that want to be part of it. And so you're seeing this grow more and more and more. And I believe that this is really the global South that is trying to work together to figure out specifically on economy, but also on social, on political, and maybe even on military over time, but I'm not sure about that. Definitely on finance, how they can actually become more independent from America primarily.
Well, starting by not using dollars on the transaction
yes,
amongst them.
Of course, but I don't think the dollar will erode that fast. I mean, there's no better second best alternative to the dollar in the world. Although some countries would like to deal differently, but people are not going to switch to rubles or to Chinese renminbi. But between them, they could. And that's the interesting. So it's not going to go for global trade or global reserve currency. But if Brazil or Argentina wants to trade with China, they can do that in their own currency. And that is where the dollar is going to erode, in trade between countries in the global South, not from a money point of view globally.
Pascal, we are in the last 3 minutes of our conversation. It goes as fast as the Chinese trains. Tell me something. What do you foresee? And of course, as we are recording, Americans are voting. We don't know what happened there. But knowing how pragmatic Chinese are, what do you foresee that would be China's way forward?
Related to the election or not related? No. So I mean, China's way forward is very simple. They've actually made a formula for it. It's called the New Quality Productive Forces. And the New Quality Productive Forces basically means that they want to educate 1.4 billion people to elevate the education level as quickly as possible, to make all of them scientists. They want to focus as much as possible on engineering and on innovation. They want to raise the productivity. And I think that's the model. So in a way, you could say that China sees its problems of the economy being resolved by innovation. And they have the resources of data, they have the resources of people, and they have money. It's just on the savings accounts. It's not spending anymore. So if they can combine all this, they believe that they can get out of their economic challenges. And that is their way forward, which I call China's next miracle.
Do you really think that China will lead world's economy? Is it possible?
I think they don't want to lead.
Okay.
But I do believe in many areas they will lead, but I don't think they want to have the responsibility that America takes on leading the world.
They'll just be leading because of the work that they are doing, and nobody else is working as fast and as good as China is working. Well, Pascal, thank you so much for being with us. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations with you. And obviously, when I spoke to you the first time, I was surprised. After going to China and talking to you the second time, I'm not saying I'm in love, but yeah, I was fascinated. By the China that I saw, and I just saw a small part of it. Thank you so much for being with us, and I'll see you later in our dinner. Thank you so much. Não, agora já pode ser em português. Muito obrigado a si que nos acompanhou em mais um programa. Já sabe, pode rever estas conversas subscrevendo o canal de YouTube do Isto é o Povo a Falar. Partilhe também, coloque o seu gosto, utilize as redes sociais para divulgar esta e outras conversas. Resta-me agradecer a todos vocês que nos viram, a vocês que nos ouviram na rádio, e dizer que estamos de volta para um próximo programa. Muito obrigado. Boa noite.